Today, we're going to explore decision-making from an individual perspective. How we should do it, if we were perfectly rational, if we were perfectly logical, if we had all the information, and how we do it, since we're not. Okay, but first, let's take a look at the prescription, how we should do it. And people who study problem solving and decision making come up typically with something that's known as the general analytical model. If we could get that up on the screen from the computer. Is it up? Not up yet? Aha. Okay. Conception of decision making as a series of analytical steps. This means it focuses on two aspects. The first is identifying the problem. You don't make a decision unless you identify that there are some alternatives out there that you need to consider in order to get you to some goal. So first you have to identify the problem. And the second thing it focuses in on is implementing the solution. So decision making really has two things. We often think of it as soon as we get to the alternative and make a choice, that's it. But in management, it goes a step further. You haven't really completed the process until you implement the solution and then go a step further and monitor. So if we take a look at what this whole thing looks like, it starts with problem identification. This seems on the face of it to be a no-brainer. You know when you have a problem. But the truth is, you don't always identify the problem correctly, if you identify it at all. What's the problem here? Well, people ignore information, people discount information, people deny information. And so solving the problem, making the right decision, is not always as easy as it seems when we start with the point of problem identification. One other thing people frequently do too in all of this issue in decision making, and that is blame fixing. So they're looking in the wrong place for making the decision, and they're looking to put the problem onto somebody else. So all of these things are problems. Let's take an example of something that we might follow through in this whole cycle. You're working for an organization. The problem is profits are going down. All right, that's easily identified. But then, in terms of how you handle it, the question becomes, why are profits going down? And how you decide what the issue is there is how you're going to make your decision. So how do you go about that? Well, the next stage is defining the objectives. What do you want to accomplish with your decision? Profits are going down. Do you need to increase market share? Or maybe, do you need to cut down on the costs of production? You need to fix it somewhere. The pre-decision stage is an interesting kind of stage because that all begins with how are you actually framing your decision and how are you going to decide to make your decision. This is a decision you can make on your own. And you might choose to make it on your own, but you might choose to make it on your own for all the wrong reasons. You're under pressure, you're under stress, and you don't have time to consult with anybody else. They're just going to get in your way. Or you already know what you want to do, and you don't want anybody to interfere with that. Another wrong reason for deciding to go on your own. You're going to do it with a group. You could introduce, at this point, decision support systems to help you in framing the problem. Decision support systems are computer programs that help you in terms of defining the problem and looking at alternatives in terms of solutions. And often these decision support systems rely on expert judgment of people who really know the area well, and allows you to draw on this base of information which has been modeled into the system. generate alternatives. Here are the possible solutions to the problem. Often, we close down too quickly in identifying alternatives. This is the point where you need to be creative. This is the point where you need to break out of possibly using yesterday's solution, which is what we often do because that's the easiest thing to do. Using yesterday's solution, go back to what we know about reinforcement theory. It doesn't take any effort on your part. Looking for a new solution to the problem, doing something a new way, it's going to require effort and it's going to require time to think about alternatives. From a manager's perspective, if you were leading a group in terms of this, you want to make sure that all of the alternatives are heard from your group. Chances are, and we'll talk about this next time when we do group problem solving, that on an individual basis, the intelligence is there to solve it. The question is, are you going to be able to draw it out of the individuals? So this is a time not to evaluate. This is a time to generate, and that's the distinction. Because it's not till you get to the next step where you engage in evaluating the alternatives. You want to make sure that you don't jam these two together, generating alternatives and evaluating alternatives. And at that point, you weigh the pluses and minuses of the various alternatives. Some things might be good decisions, but it's going to take you too long to get to that point. You need a shorter-term solution for now, and you understand you need a shorter-term solution. Or it's going to be too expensive. The organization simply can't afford the system that would be the Cadillac of the systems. And so you will settle for something that is less than optimal. The next stage, obviously, is make a choice after you go through whatever analysis you do, cost-benefit analysis in terms of weighing alternatives. Implement it, put it into action, and then finally evaluate it. And that part is another part that often gets cut out of the whole decision-making process. We make the decision and we let it drop right there. We don't see whether it meets the objectives. Sort of pray that it works. Work on faith. But you do need to find out if the problem is still existing. So various different things that you could use to solve a problem such as profits dropping. You have to go in and figure out where it's occurring in the organization and then make the right decision and the right choice in terms of solving it. Some types of decisions that have been identified. Programmed versus non-programmed decisions. Programmed decisions, highly routine. Usually done by lower-level people in the organization and usually done alone. Time to fill the requisition for toner for the copy machine. Very routine. When it gets to a certain point, whoever's responsibility is fills it, knows what vendor to go to, that's it. All programmed. Hardly a decision. Non-programmed decisions require more problem solving in terms of making them. Because these are about novel problems, they're about things that don't occur every day. There is no set course of action. And an example would be identifying the cause of some rare disease. And many of the problems that occur at high levels in management are these strategic, non-program types of problems. And that's why they're paying CEOs big bucks to solve these sorts of things. Sometimes you go into uncharted territory. You don't know what's going to happen. Government has deregulated certain industries. Which is the way to go now in terms of deregulation? How are you going to survive in terms of deregulation? Everything had been set for you before in terms of the marketplace. You didn't have to mount a big marketing campaign. You didn't have to sell yourself. You had a territory. You were a utility company. You had a specific territory, and you had to lock on that. If somebody wanted gas and electric, they had to go to you, and everybody needs gas and electric. How are you going to survive in an economy where it goes to deregulation, and suddenly you're going to have to compete with other companies from all over the country. Now you have to devise some kind of strategy. A whole new set of decisions need to go into place so you can be competitive and you can keep selling the power that you're selling. So those are the differences in it. Sometimes decisions go from non-programmed to programmed. And I think Monday on the New York Stock Exchange, where the Dow Jones fell over 500 points, the most it's ever fallen, not the largest percentage fall, that's for sure, but the most it's ever fallen, became very interesting. Trading was automatically halted twice on Monday at two different points. First, it was halted for, when it went through about a 150-point drop, it was halted for a short time. And then ultimately, it was almost the end of the trading day, but trading ended altogether after it had dropped something like exceeded 550 points. The decision to stop trading was programmed into the system. They took it out of the hands of individual decision makers. How did that come about? That came about from a situation that happened back in 1987 when there was another free fall on the market. And there's something called program trading. That is, you put in automatic sell offers when your stock goes below a certain point. You don't want to keep it anymore. You've made the profit that you made and you don't want to lose the profit. So that was already in place in 1987. There were automatic sell offers. Once the market started to drop, the automatic sell offers were accelerating like crazy. And it overloaded the market till it hit a very large percentage drop. I don't remember the percentage. I've been looking at it all week. It was like around 15% of a drop or something like that, I believe. And so when it went into this automated free fall, the people there said, maybe we can't wait for people to make judgments on this situation. We've got to take it out of the hands of individuals in this case and program it into place. So sometimes we give decisions over to computers because people are slow and they're not making the most rational of judgments, particularly under times of stress, which is what you're hitting in that kind of situation. Imagine what it must have been like on the trading floor that day. Okay. Another type of decision. Certain versus uncertain decisions. Well, if we had certainty about our decisions all the time, again, no-brainers, it would be really easy. We'd know exactly what to do. Either it was going to work or it wasn't going to work. So we could approach it, we could engage in it, or we could avoid it. But life isn't like that. And usually it's someplace in between. There's a certain amount of uncertainty attached to the decisions. There's risk involved. Well, risk means that there's a probability attached to it. And sometimes you can specify what the probability is. We rely on odds makers in some instances for making decisions as to what we're going to do. You participate in the local football pool, and odds are attached to who's the favorite and who isn't the favorite, okay, based on already decisions that people are making and some other things that go into it. So it gives you something, a notion about the risk, but sometimes you can't specify what the risk is on something. You don't know what the probability is, and so you begin to rely on intuitions as a way of doing it. How do we minimize risk in this situation? Well, the best way of minimizing risk is to get as much information as we possibly can about the situation. Schools admit students in. They want to minimize the risk in the students they've admitted because it's costly to bring in a student and then have that student not complete the program. You've wasted time and space and instructor effort on it, and in the end, as a school, it counts against you when you don't graduate students. Your retention rate goes down. How do you make a decision about bringing in students as to whether they're going to complete the program or not? Well, certain formulas have been generated. Formulas generated based on SAT scores and based on grade point averages, which are plugged into a computer. That, along with a few other things, allows for some kind of prediction as to whether the student will make it or not. So models are built all the time. We have models built regarding students entering schools. We have economic models built all the time as to whether certain types of programs will succeed and what's going to happen. Complex kinds of things that are all done to help minimize risk. And should you buy a stock, shouldn't you buy a stock? Well, you go to the experts, and they're going to look at all of this information that they have, and they may have built it into certain models and saying, well, prediction doesn't look good for this stock based on all of these kinds of things. Or, yeah, now's the time to buy, based on lots of different numbers that are plugged into it. Experts often come to rely on, in terms of making judgments, a couple of key indicators that they become comfortable with. And they begin to make judgments somewhat intuitively, but based on a lot of information that they've developed over the years. Doctors do the same things. How do they decide what illness that you have? They look at a few symptoms. They may make a mistake. Doctors make mistakes in diagnosing. It happens. It's the incorrect decision. But the best doctors over the years build up this fund of information and are able to come up with good decisions. It takes some of the risk out of it. To help areas of the country where there are not the same level of doctors with expertise, they've come up with programs. So you can call up a hospital, plug in all of the various symptoms that you see, and the program will spit out different possible choices as to what it could be. And makes very good diagnoses, sometimes obviously making better diagnoses than a young, inexperienced doctor might make, or doctors who don't often get to see this sort of thing. So another type of decision support system that we have built in and made available to people in parts of the country where they would not necessarily have this. How do we go about making decisions? What is it that we're doing? We're going to look at 3 different models. The first model was the preferred model of the economists for many years, the model of the rational man. This presumed in this model that in making a decision, any decision, even what car you want to buy, whether to put money into savings or whether to pay off your credit card, whatever it was, that you had all the information that was necessary to make the decision. You knew all of the alternatives, and that in weighing the alternatives, you would be perfectly rational and perfectly logical. What this meant was that in many instances, economic models of how decisions should be made regarding, particularly looked at in judgments about people's portfolios, didn't match the actual thing that was going on, because we're not perfectly rational. We don't gather all the information that we need, and it's very hard to know what all the alternatives are. The problem we have as humans is we don't know what we don't know. That's the problem. And so you don't know how to gather all that information. So this model, as a model for making decisions, is often called normative or prescriptive. Maybe this is how we should do it, but it sure isn't how we do it. How do we do it? We're going to take a look at then 2 other models. The bounded rationality model of March and Simon, 2 well-known people in the area of decision-making in organizations. This model of decision-making says that humans have a limited view of the problem, that we don't have perfect information, that we don't have all the alternatives. So we accept a solution that is good enough. It seems to meet at least our basic minimal requirements at the time. And this good enough solution is called satisficing, a term that they coined. It satisfies the criteria that we're aware of and that we're using without necessarily being optimal. The difference between the optimal solution and the satisficing solution would be looking for a needle in a haystack. And if you're optimizing, if you want the best, you keep looking until you find the very best needle in the haystack. But if you're engaged in bounded rationality, you stop as soon as you find one that's going to work. That's the difference between the two. And you can see that most often we stop when we find something that's going to work. We don't keep going and looking for something that might be better. It's going to take too much effort. It's going to take too much time. And very often we have neither of those. And yet, one other theory that describes how we go about making decisions, image theory. And this one relies on notions that we act intuitively much of the time, that we have gut instincts about what is the right way to go, and much of what happens afterward is kind of rationalizing what feels right to us. And that decision of feeling right, feeling wrong, which sometimes is called hot processing as opposed to cool, rational, cold processing, is a judgment that we arrive at very quickly in terms of perceiving options or if we're making judgments about people. It happens automatically. We can't help it happening. You sometimes have to fight it. But when you're interviewing people for a job, there is a feeling very quickly on, even while you're going through the interview and you're processing and you're drawing out lots of information about, I feel comfortable with this person. Something about this person puts me off. We've hot processed already. We've made some kind of implicit judgment. And so with image theory, we go through a two-step process. And the first step says, does this alternative feel right to me? You're making a decision about schools, and you go around and you visit a lot of different schools. Some schools are going to feel right, and some schools are going to feel uncomfortable. Same thing is going to happen in job interviews. Some job interviews, for whatever happens, are going to feel comfortable. And some job interviews, you're going to walk out feeling, this organization is not for me. And it may not be a rational judgment. That judgment, it will be rationalized, but that initial judgment of feels right, feels wrong may not be rational and may be based on the person who interviews you and who made you feel comfortable. Is a possibility. Status, prestige, people who you know who are already working there, comfort level. Okay, so that's the first step. Does it feel right, the gut instinct? The second step is now you've got these, once you've got the ones that feel okay, then you engage in what is called profitability, and that is, among the alternatives that feel right, which one is going to be the best one? At that stage, you engage in a little bit more cool processing and rational processing, as opposed to the first hot processing that we go through. So, decision making. Economists often thought we were cool and logical. It became evident that we're not so cool and logical, but that really what we're doing as humans is we're engaging in both the emotional processing and the logical processing simultaneously, and they're merging. We're one person. We do engage in both of them, but we can't deny that other aspect. And because of the emotional aspect that goes on in processing, sometimes we do want to take decisions out of the hands of humans and put them into computers. Computers are always going to look at all the alternatives, weigh all of them equally, not be prejudicial in anything. We'll call up all the information that's in the base and come up with the cool, logical, rational decision that has been programmed into it, and won't be swayed by irrelevant kinds of things, will not ignore information. So sometimes we think computers, a cold way to do it, but you might want that cold, cool way of doing it because it will provide the better decision. Which then leads us to start talking about all of these imperfect decisions that we make. Before class, I asked you to read through a little problem and make a choice. It has to do with something called framing. Let me first, as a way of introducing all of this, say that the reason we make imperfect decisions is because we are imperfect information processors. We can't handle all the information that we really need to. We ignore information. We forget information. We engage in a lot of things that lead us to decisions which are not perfect. And typically what we do as shortcuts to making decisions is we use something called heuristics. Let me write the term down if you're not familiar with it. This is a trick. These are shortcuts that we develop in decision making. Instead of going through everything, we have little rules of thumb that we rely on. This is going to work because it's worked before. And indeed, these heuristics often help us make decisions quickly. But sometimes they hinder us. And the two researchers, actually three, but we'll start out, who did really groundbreaking work in looking at these rules of thumb that we use and the mistakes are Tversky and Kahneman. And then, building on that, Max Bazerman out of University of Michigan did even more work. And the various examples, demonstrations we're going to be going through today, are either some developed by Bazerman or those used by Kahneman and Tversky. First thing we're going to talk about is framing. And framing talks about how decisions are posed to us. Are they posed in positive or negative ways? Okay, I asked you to go through one example, and you took care of that. Now I want you to take a minute and look at a second and see what decision you come up with. You all have little pink slips of paper. Make your choice of C or D. And then I'm going to ask you to pass it back to Altanique, who is going to be our equivalent of Price Waterhouse in this case. And she's going to collect and do the count. And we're going to see what kinds of differences in decisions we may have come up with. This is a bit of risk-taking in this class, because we're going to see if the decision holds or not. In this case, and let me read it for people who are ultimately going to be watching this on tape and may have a problem. The problem states that there's a large car manufacturer which has recently been hit with a number of economic difficulties. And it appears as if 3 plants need to be closed and 6,000 employees laid off. Okay, 3 plants closed, 6,000 employees laid off. The vice president of production has been exploring different ways to avoid the crisis, and she's developed 2 plans in this instance. And Plan C will result in the loss of 2 of 3 plants and 4,000 jobs. Plan D has a 2/3 probability or resulting in the loss of all 3 plants and all 6,000 jobs, okay, 2/3 chance of that. a 1/3 chance probability of losing no plants and no jobs. So make a choice, C or D. Okay, don't spend too much time on it, and let's pass it back to Altanique. Okay? And then let's see what happened with our attempt at a demonstration in different framing of problems. Okay, if you hadn't already filled out the green one, hold on that. Okay, let it go. Okay, everybody's filled out? Okay. Now we're going to back up and do the one that you did initially on framing, which had exactly the same problem, but two different alternatives. In this case, Plan A, the plan saves one of 3 plants and 2,000 jobs, and Plan B has a 1/3 probability of saving all 3 plants and all 6,000 jobs, but a 2/3 probability of saving no plants and no jobs. Okay, Larry, on the green ones, how many took A and how many took B?
I got 5 A's and 1 B.
Okay. A equals 5.
6 A's.
6 A's. 6 A's.
And 1 B.
And 1 B. If you notice, the problem was phrased in the positive in this instance. Okay, it was positively phrased. You could save plants. Okay, there was a sure gain to be had in one instance, in that it definitely was going to save one of the 3 plants. The second one took a gamble. Okay, there was a 1/3 probability of saving all the plants, not a very big one, and 2/3 probability of saving no plants and no jobs. What it turns out is that in the face of a sure gain, we are risk averse. We won't want to take the chance of losing something that we know we can have. The bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. The adage holds for us. We'll take it. Positively phrased, we take the sure gain. Now, let's go. Same problem, but the alternatives were negatively phrased. Altanique, what have you got? Okay, this is the positive phrasing. That one worked. Okay, on the negative phrasing, what have you got in terms of C and D?
I got 6 C's and 2 D's.
And 2 D's. Okay, negative. This didn't work quite as well. I think I have to go back and look at it. Because what framing says is that in the face of a loss, we tend to be risk-seeking. We'll take a gamble to try to avoid the loss. Okay, now, in this case, there was a little bit more gambling. I could say that there was twice as much as in the other case, but it didn't work out quite as well. In reality, A and C are the same, and B and D are the same. What has typically happened when people have the choice of doing this? Well, people typically prefer A to B by 3 to 1. We did even better than that. The sure thing of saving 2,000 jobs to the risk of saving all of them. On the second alternative, people usually take D to C by 3 to 1. Didn't happen here. But the truth is you got a chance to do both of them, so you were exposed. People are typically not exposed to doing all of the alternatives. And people want to avoid the sure loss. Plan C provides a sure loss. Plan D allows you to gamble. Risk-seeking depending on how it's phrased. Now, one more time we'll try this framing business and see what happens. More framing. What's your choice? Show of hands on this one. Okay, if we can have the cameras. How many would take A over B? Okay, how many would take a sure gain of 240 compared to a 25% chance to gain 1,000, 75% chance to gain nothing? How many want A in the class? Only one? How many want B? You're gambling. Okay. Not working here. It's the risk of doing these sorts of things. Okay, again, usually people, 84% of the people will take A over B. Now what about D? A sure loss of 750 to the 75% chance to lose 1,000, 25% chance to lose nothing. Usually, people, now I'm not going to try, I'm getting less risk-seeking, you notice. I'm not going to ask the question. 87% will take D to C. Okay, will take the risk of losing $1,000. And remember, that's a pretty big risk you're taking there. You know that 73 out of 4 times that's going to happen, that you're going to lose the $1,000. But even for that one small 25% chance to lose nothing, it's worth it to us. We become risk-seeking. The question then becomes, what does all of this mean? This framing of things. What it means is that our judgments are pushed in certain ways depending on how people state problems to us. Do they state them in a positive way, or do they state them in a negative way? Salesmen know this, particularly insurance salespeople who are trying to get you to buy insurance and want you to try to minimize your risks of certain things, and will phrase questions in a way to push your decision in that process. But I've been thinking about elections since we're just a few days away from Election Day. And let's see how this is used by people who are incumbents in holding office and people who are challenging and trying to get the job. If you're an incumbent, you want people to be risk averse. Stay with the sure thing. That means you spend all your time talking about all the positive things that you did. And that's why you should be reelected. Don't take a chance. I've done all of these positive things and I can continue doing them if you reelect me. Gee, have you heard that at all in any of the campaigns from the incumbents? You bet. And the challenger outside needs to get people to be risk-seeking. Phrase it in the negative. Pull all the negatives out that you possibly can about your opponent to make people feel as if they need to take the chance and gamble on the outsider. Our natural inclinations to take the sure gain, don't gamble, but we don't want loss, and there we try to avoid it. This isn't the only fallacies or cognitive biases that we engage in. There are more. What are some of these others? Well, the availability heuristic. With the availability heuristic, people have a tendency to base decisions on information that is easily accessed, the stuff that we can come up with most readily, that we know about. Let's try a couple of examples of this. Which is riskier, do you think? Driving a car on a 400-mile trip or flying on a 400-mile trip on a commercial flight? I'm going to put somebody on the spot in the class. Kunwa, which do you think is riskier?
A.
A. Well, in this case, you're right. Okay, so another one of my demonstrations has gone down. But typically, people, if you ask them, will choose B. Why would they choose B over A? Anybody have an idea? Yeah, Kelly.
Because in a plane ride, they feel like they have less control over the situation.
Right, they're not driving the plane. Exactly. Okay, and the other thing is that when a plane crashes, we hear about it. It's a dramatic event when a plane crashes or a train crashes. How many car accidents do you hear about every day? I mean, they just tell you, you know, when you're listening to the reports, the traffic reports, there's an accident here, there's an accident there, and we become sort of cold and inured to car accidents, even though on a passenger mile there are a lot more car accidents than there are plane accidents. So if you're talking about particularly the large commercial flights, the big ones, the big jets, they're pretty safe. They don't have too many accidents in those things, okay? And lots of car accidents, and yet we go for the dramatic as opposed to the things that we don't hear about. Let's try another one. I don't know that I put it up, but let me, no, okay, move back. Yeah. If you're traveling in the Middle East, which is the greater worry? Being hurt in an auto accident or being hurt in a terrorist attack? Larry, you wanted to answer before. Now what do you think?
I think it's, well, I think it's A.
You think it's A?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I cued you in on this. And the answer is you're absolutely right. Okay, but typically people will worry more about being in a terrorist attack. You don't want to drive in the Middle East. Crazy. Lots more car accidents than terrorist attacks. The probability of being hurt in a car accident, far greater. But we never hear about car accidents in the Middle East, and we do hear about terrorist attacks. The dramatic things that catch our attention. So the reason that we get biased in terms of availability has to do with what's in the media, what we can more readily recall, and we draw on those when we go to make decisions, which means we're probably leaving a lot of information out. The other thing that fits easily into this and helps us distort our decision making is we often rely only on our own experience, which is readily available to us in making decisions. And we generalize from our own experience to everybody else. And we think that that's how everybody else is thinking and how everybody else behaves as well, because that's what we have available. Another fallacy in decision making in humans. We fail to consider lots of other types of experiences that people have in our generalizations. What this means, interestingly, is if you're trying to move a decision in a certain direction, the thing to do is to try to give a presentation which is going to be dramatic and vivid and that people will easily remember. How do you do this? Well, don't do it with lots of statistics. You will put people to sleep and they won't remember what you're talking about. But do it with graphics, do it with stories, do it with something in which people can easily catch on to, somehow identify with and remember. If you have to use statistics, do it graphically. Pie charts, other types of graphs, so that people can grab onto those numbers in some easy way to remember, and then, as they're making their decisions, the information is more readily recalled. So it can work for you as well. Availability heuristic. But that's not all. There are other problems that we have as well. The representativeness heuristic. Our tendency to perceive others in stereotypical ways if they appear to be typical of the category to which they belong. Mark is finishing his MBA at a prestigious university. He's very interested in the arts and at one time considered a career as a musician. Mark is most likely to take a job as A, in the management of the arts, or B, with a management consulting firm. What do you think? I'll try one more time. If we can go to the class, who am I going to call on this time? Jeff, what do you think?
A.
Ah, okay. Demonstration worked. Thank you. Why A?
He's going to get his degree in
Yeah.
management, right?
Right, but why the arts as opposed to a consulting firm?
'Cause that's what he has an interest in.
That's what he has an interest in. Okay, so we're using stereotypes in terms of making our decisions instead of using base information. The truth is, if you have nothing else to go on and you had to just make a decision, the more probable decision is, where do most MBA students take jobs? Forget Mark as the individual, but put the collective, where do most MBA students take jobs? Most of them more likely take jobs with management consulting firms than in management of the arts. But we get hooked on this all the time. We get hooked on Mark as the individual instead of going to the broader base of information for making our decision. There's another one that's similar to this, and it has to deal with Linda. Linda is a graduate of a university. In the university, she was interested in social causes and protested. But she graduates with a major in business and goes on to work for some organization. The question about Linda is she more likely to be a banker, or is she more likely to be a banker and interested and active in feminist causes? Okay? What do you think? What would be your judgment about Linda? Tony?
I would say A, because you mentioned that she was interested in social causes, but you didn't mention which ones, and to assume that they're feminist
Right.
would be to make a representative.
That would be a representative mistake, but you would make it for another reason too. And again, you're ignoring base information. If you had to make a choice, you always go with the bigger one. Okay? To say that she's working for a bank encompasses a lot. You're narrowing your selection down if you say that she's working for a bank and she's active in feminist causes. Now you've got a subset within that. Okay? So in all of these, in terms of making judgments and decisions, we get trapped. And we all get trapped in our own stereotypes of how people behave. And we ignore base information, which would make our decision more likely. We get hung up on the fact that I said that she had been interested in social causes, to say, oh yeah, it's much more likely that not only would she be working for a bank, but now she's going to be active in feminist causes. Because that fits our stereotype that I had you conjure up about Linda. So another bias that we engage in all the time as we're making decisions about people. And this really brings us back to a lot of stuff that we talked about much earlier in the semester in perception, that we use all kinds of information about people that may be irrelevant in making judgments about them. And we come up with the wrong decision about people, because we're keying in on irrelevant information to the decision. Get rid of that information. Not necessary, distorting the decision-making process. But that's not all. It's amazing with all of this that we ever make a good decision. We engage in a host of other cognitive biases as well. One of the problems we have is anchoring. And here we develop estimates based on some initial information. And then when that initial information turns out to be wrong or it changes, we have to adjust our decision. The problem is, because of first impressions, we fail to adjust enough. We're anchored in some initial information, or sometimes we can't get rid of that initial impression altogether, and we keep coming back to it. It keeps biasing our attempts to make decisions because of some initial impressions that we were given. How does this work out? Well, I want to toss out an interesting piece of information, a statistic that was tossed around a few years ago, ultimately seemed to have no basis in reality. You may or may not be familiar with it, but the data that was tossed out was that spouse abuse of women, increases on Super Bowl Sunday. When that was examined, had no basis in fact. But it got rooted in a lot of minds. And if you ask people about incidents of spouse abuse who had heard that data, which had sort of a face validity to it, it's in there. And they can't shake that in terms of making judgments about what happens. It turned out that that was, on the average, no worse than any other day. But it affected people in terms of decisions that they were making, and promotions. Don't allow the Super Bowl to be watched in your house and things like that. Another example that we have of anchoring that sometimes takes place would be if a company, in using comparison data to another company, uses the wrong information. And this has happened in the past. But by the time the company was brought up on charges by, I think it was the FCC for truth in advertising, that information was already out there to the public. And they have to print a small retraction, but people are not going to focus on the small retraction. They're already anchored in the wrong information. And so first impressions in terms of information counts for a lot and keeps biasing our judgments all the way down the line. We can't shake certain things about people, particularly, but it could be data as well. And if somebody plants erroneous data out there, that could bias our judgments. We anchor. Yet another problem that we have is something called confirmation bias. We have a tendency to confirm what we already believe. We talked about that before when we talked about perception, and now we have to come back and talk about it regarding decision making. We tend to focus on evidence that supports decisions we've already made. How do we come to engage in confirmation bias? Well, one of the ways that we engage in it is that we tend to, once we make a decision, rationalize that decision by seeking only information that supports it and ignoring, denying, trivializing, minimizing any information that might go against it. Sometimes we engage in a process called post-decision dissonance. Looking to buy a computer. How do you go about buying a computer? Well, if you're anything like our family, when we buy a computer, the first thing we do is we go to Computer Shopper and we look through all the ads. And you lay out a grid. This brand gives you all of these features, here's the price, and you go all the way down. So you're doing a lot of research on it, and you're looking at a lot of different alternatives. And eventually you have to come up with one of them. And you have to decide a store that you're going to get it in. So at some point you make the choice. Time to stop looking, time to buy. And you come up with what looks like the best computer for the best buy, until you open the newspaper the next day and you see the same computer offered by another store and it's less money. Or you see another computer for the same price, but it has a lot more features to it. Post-decision dissonance. Quickly go buy that. You don't even want to read about it. What you want to do is bolster up all the arguments for the decision that you made. So we ignore, we purposely no longer look at ads for computers. The one thing we don't want to hear is from our friends who say, I could have gotten a better deal for you. And we start to build up all the arguments about why the computer we chose was such a good computer. Yeah, maybe you could have gotten it for a little bit less, but the service wouldn't be nearly as good in that store. You start to add in arguments, the intangibles that aren't printed there, to rationalize our decision. Confirmation bias. Or we have friends who've made the same choice, and we spend time talking to them. You ever notice people who buy Apple computers and Macs and how they hang together and how they justify their choice compared to the PC? There's continual justification and rationalization and confirmation bias for their choice to stay, in this instance, with the Mac. Another example of it. So seeking this out. And then yet another of these cognitive biases, we have overconfidence. Overconfidence means that because of confirmation bias, because of our tendency to bolster up our decisions and not even think or hear about other alternatives, we are more confident than we are correct. Is this good? To be more confident than possibly being correct? Well, let's think about the alternative. You have to, in order to take a course of action, believe that there's going to be better than a 50% chance of something occurring. Because if there's less than a 50% chance, you're going to take the other course of action. If we went through the day without confidence, we'd never make a decision. We'd spend all our time second-guessing ourselves and vacillating. So we do need confidence in terms of doing anything as we proceed through the day and we make all the various decisions that we do make. The problem with overconfidence comes into the point where we fail to consider vital information and where we neglect vital information, and as we will see next time, where we trivialize it and say that information is either not important or erroneous. And so, where have we been and where are we going? We started out today by considering the general analytical model and various types of decisions. We looked at 3 models of decisions and explored why our decisions are often inadequate and why, for reasons of confirmation bias and overconfidence, we sometimes never learn about the inadequacy. We go through life thinking they're fine. Next time, we're going to expand and explore how decisions are made in groups, particularly the phenomenon of groupthink, and finally, ways to improve decision-making in groups. This becomes important, particularly as organizations use teams so much for getting anything accomplished. Next.